I've done a lot of work in neuroscience, and there tends to be a ton of placebo effect in neuroscience. And for the most part, when a study fails, an antidepressant, for example, fails, or a new AD drug fails, you don't really know why. You assume it just didn't have, some sort of pharmacodynamic effect, but that's not always the truth. It would be interesting to see if this is an approach to really be able to understand what's really going on in those types of
That was
studies.
Dr. Rockwood's experience. So if he was here, he would tell you these stories in a much more eloquent way. He was on the front lines trying to measure these things, but he has numerous stories in the early days of the early AD drugs, which, okay, they weren't blockbusters. They weren't going to solve everybody's problem. They weren't going to reverse or eliminate Alzheimer's disease, but they were having an effect, and they just couldn't pick it up with the traditional outcomes. So there was all this anecdote coming from the patients, coming from the caregivers, coming from the clinicians. Something's happening, something's being improved. And there was all this language, coming from the patients, like the curtains have been opened. It's no longer cloudy. I can see more clearly. I can articulate myself more clearly. So some of the early examples that he gave were, in some particular cases, talking to the sponsor and the sponsor not knowing exactly how the intervention was going to work. So one example he gave me once was around the sponsor being convinced that the drug did have an effect, which wasn't being picked up, and that the effect was on improved memory. But once they dove into the data and saw a treatment effect with goal attainment scaling, they were able to see that it was actually coming from improved executive function, not from memory, because none of the memory goals were improving, but all the executive function goals were actually driving the change. So it's true, you can kind of pick it up. It's a very sensitive measure, but then you can use it to actually dive into the data a little more closely. It's also data that allows you to just understand what's important to people. So if you have 50 people in a trial and they each set three goals around what's most important to them, then you have 150 data points for what people actually care about and why they would want this intervention. And it might be different from what the sponsor thinks. So, what the sponsor or the clinician might think is a meaningful change or an important change for them might not be what's actually driving the person to want to take the treatment or to want to adhere to treatment. It might be something else. So that information is also interesting. And right now we spend zillions of dollars on open-ended journals and embedded interviews and all of these things where goal attainment scaling gives you a little bit of all of it.